I really wanted those 7 days to be consecutive, and they were more scattered than that. At the end of my last video, I said that one thing that I wanted to do was learn a bit more about modeling, or at least attempt modeling, so that I could get in the assets that I wanted for the game. And so I started off by modeling a gun, and that took me about 4 different tries to end up actually modeling in a way that was good and that would actually work inside of Unity. There were so many mistakes that took place in between the first attempt and the attempt that actually made it into what you'll see later. And there's a car outside. A lot of those mistakes were basically just me not knowing what I was doing in Blender and partially messing up the hotkeys a bajillion times. And sometimes the easiest way to just get over that was to restart the model, and I think I ended up with something that was pretty good. I had some help from a friend of mine who kind of helped me finish it up in a way that wasn't completely terrible, but it's in there now, it's good. Unfortunately, importing it from Blender to Unity was a completely different task, because turns out in Blender, the normals get flipped 100 times, which is not something I even knew was possible. So going from Blender into Unity, there were faces of the model that were missing, and it took me forever to finish that up, and that was essentially 24 hours. Well, not 24 hours because I went to bed, but it was a good chunk of time. It was a day. It was a work day. Also, even when it was in Unity and it was in Unity fine, it was huge for a very long time, and this is a constant issue I have with Unity, where things just don't scale properly, and it's definitely me doing something wrong, and I haven't figured it out yet. Even that little scale button, the button lets you scale things in Blender, sometimes just doesn't work when I export FBXs, so who knows. We'll try to figure it out in the future. I also took some time to attempt to UV unwrap this model before just using the Smart Unwrap and throwing it into Substance Painter. I haven't used Substance Painter before, but I was able to put a really basic texture on top of the gun and then put an emissive texture on top of that. This took me a really long time to get working in Unity, even though the emissive map exported correctly and was in the material in Unity. The emission itself wasn't actually happening, and it wasn't until about like 2 or 3 hours in that I realized that I just hadn't adjusted the color in Unity properly. As it turns out, Unity doesn't just take the emission and apply it. You need to go into Unity and change the color of the emission itself, even if in Substance it's already been set. So if you're ever using emission in Unity, make sure to drag that slider, otherwise it will not work. Just a pro tip. So the next thing I worked on was enemy spawning and making sure that the enemies weren't overlapping each other or weren't too close to each other as they were spawning. This was actually pretty easy to implement. All I did was get a few empty game objects and position them around the scene as spawn points. Then I used the function from the Unity documentation, random.InsideUnitSphere, to randomize a spawn location inside of a given radius where the center of that circle was the selected spawn point. Then, to make sure that the enemies weren't overlapping each other or weren't too close to each other, I used the physics.checkSphere function to make sure that no one was too close to each other within a given sphere that checks for enemy colliders. Once enemies were spawned in, all I had to do was make sure that they fired at the player. This was pretty easy to implement. All I had to do is get the position of the enemy's gun, which at this point in time was just an empty game object that was a child of the enemy's hand, and the position of the player itself, which was just the main camera in the scene. Then I normalized the difference between those two vectors so I would get the necessary direction that a bullet would have to travel to hit the player's head from the position of the enemy's gun. Once I take that vector and apply its force to an instantiated bullet game object, the bullet just flies along a path as if the enemy shot it from their hand directly towards the player's head. The next thing I did was put my excellent modeling skills to use once more and modeled, rigged, and animated an enemy character for use in the game. This was definitely a messy process, but it's in the game perfectly now, and there are definitely no issues whatsoever with the way that the enemies move inside of the game. Please don't ask any questions. To wrap things up, I fixed some minor bugs and polished some things that definitely needed polish, and then implemented UI that is kind of broken, but at this point I'm over that, so it's just going to stay on screen the entire time until I look back at the project and fix it. The polish I did add included some particle systems and some vibration when you shoot the controller, so it doesn't have absolutely no feedback at all anymore. There is a little bit of player feedback and some haptics that I was able to play around with the touch controller, so I'm pretty proud of that. And for those sounds, I just played around in SFXR for a while, which is a really cool tool you can use to create sounds quickly. So if you ever need it, I highly recommend SFXR. And that's basically it. I definitely didn't get everything I wanted to get done, and there's a whole lot in the game that needs lots and lots of work. But for my first time ever venturing into VR development, and for the first time I've worked on a solo project in a really, really long time, I think I did pretty okay. There are definitely a lot of improvements to be made. I think the gameplay could be more engaging first and foremost, and it could definitely be more challenging. The codebase itself right now is very spaghetti-like, so making those improvements might be difficult, but if I ever do end up revisiting that project, I look forward to seeing what I can do. Another thing that could be really useful and that would be easy to implement is better feedback, specifically when the player gets hit. There's currently no way of tracking your health or if you took damage, which makes really frustrating gameplay, especially when I was testing. For now though, I'm excited to move on to my next project, which is going to be implementing lots of game feel and juice into a really basic game of Pong that I'm going to make in the Godot engine, which is an engine I've never touched before, or at least not in recent years. I think the last time I opened it up was in like 2016 or 2017. So if you're interested in game feel, in juice, and in exploring the Godot engine with me, stick around.